A working-class veteran and his German shepherd were fixing a rotting attic floor under heavy rain when the dog suddenly stopped, scratching at a hidden plank. Deep in the shadows, they found a rusted mailbox filled with unread letters, revealing a painful family secret. His own father had hidden every single letter from the grandfather who loved him most. This heartbreaking truth drives him deep into a misty mountain valley to claim a forgotten woodshop over an emerald pool. What this broken soldier builds from his grandfather's final design will change an entire town. And when a terrifying flash flood threatens to swallow everything, it is his loyal companion who teaches him the true meaning of sacrifice, proving that a dog's love can pierce the darkest storms to bring a family home. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country below and subscribe. The raw mountain wind howled across the rugged landscape, carrying the heavy scent of incoming rain and fallen timber. Thick, iron-gray clouds hung low over the valley, casting a somber, melancholic shadow that seemed to chill the very ground beneath, as if nature itself were bracing for a long-delayed storm. Inside the weathered workshop, the rhythmic scraping sound of a hand plane drawing across a block of oak offered the only resistance to the encroaching silence. David Rowan stood over his workbench, his large calloused hands guiding the tool with an intensity born not just from professional pride, but from a desperate need to quiet his own mind. At 45 years old, David carried the unmistakable frame of a man whose life had been forged in hardship and manual labor. He was tall and heavily built, with broad, square shoulders that remained tense even in moments of rest. His face was a map of quiet endurance, defined by a sharp, angular jawline, deeply set gray-blue eyes that rarely stayed still for long, and a thick, neatly trimmed beard peppered with silver that matched the short-cropped hair at his temples. He was a working-class carpenter, a veteran who had traded the thunder of the battlefield for the scent of sawdust. Yet the violent echoes of his military past still clung to him like an invisible shroud. Every sudden crack of splitting wood or unexpected rattle of the tin roof would send an electric jolt of panic through his veins, forcing him to freeze, his breathing turning shallow as his mind raced back to a war that had technically ended for him decades ago. Over the years, the debilitating effects of post-traumatic stress disorder had eroded his ability to trust the world, turning him into a solitary figure who spoke little, kept his head down, and chose the predictable honesty of timber over the complex betrayals of human relationships. The only true anchor keeping David tethered to the present moment was Charlie, his majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, who sat perfectly still on the dust-covered concrete floor just a few feet away. Charlie was an exceptionally large and powerful dog, possessing a thick, jet-black coat accented by deep tan markings on his broad chest and sturdy legs. But it was his eyes that truly defined him. He possessed dark, amber-colored eyes that radiated a profound, almost supernatural empathy, a gaze so deeply intuitive that he could sense the subtle shift in David's heart rate before the man even fully realized a panic attack was looming. Whenever the heavy weight of the past threatened to drown David, Charlie would quietly close the distance, pressing his warm, massive head against David's knee, offering a silent, unwavering reassurance that they were safe. Charlie had no judgment, only an absolute devotion that acted as a living fortress against the shadows in David's mind, making him far more than a service animal. He was the sole keeper of David's fragile peace. The heavy silence between the man and his dog was gently broken by a soft, shuffling footstep at the workshop door, announcing the arrival of Frank Rowan. Frank, David's 82-year-old paternal grandfather, was a small, wire-thin man whose once tall stature had been gently bowed by decades of working the land. Yet his posture still held a stubborn, old-world dignity. His face was deeply wrinkled, resembling the cracked bark of the ancient oak trees he loved, and a few wisps of snow-white hair clung to his sun-spotted scalp, framing a pair of surprisingly bright, faded blue eyes that always looked upon David with a mixture of profound affection and quiet worry. Frank was a man of immense gentleness and few words, a pillar of quiet stability in the small community who had watched his grandson retreat further into isolation over the years, always hoping that the simple peace of the countryside would eventually heal what the world had broken. He wore a faded, oversized flannel shirt and worn denim overalls, his trembling hands carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs of black coffee, the rich aroma cutting through the bitter dampness of the mountain air. Frank set the tray down on a clean corner of the workbench, looking up at David with a soft, crinkling smile that spoke volumes without needing a single word of greeting. David paused his work, his tense shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as he met his grandfather's gentle gaze, accepting the mug with a quiet nod of deep gratitude. Frank patted David's scarred forearm, his touch warm and stabilizing, before gesturing toward the old sagging ceiling above them with a slight shake of his head. He mentioned with a quiet, raspy voice that the seasonal rains were getting worse, and the ancient attic above the old family house was beginning to give way, threatening to ruin what little history they had left inside. David looked up, noting the dark, damp water stains creeping across the old wooden ceiling panels, and knew it was a task he could no longer delay for the old man who had given him a place to hide. Later that afternoon, as the misty rain began to drum a steady, chaotic rhythm against the exterior walls, David climbed the creaking wooden ladder into the dark, forgotten expanses of the estate's attic. The air up here was thick with the suffocating scent of dry rot, decades of undisturbed dust, and the stale memories of generations long gone. Charlie followed close behind, his paws clicking softly on the fragile joists as he navigated the narrow space, his ears alert and nose twitching at the unfamiliar sense of the old house. David knelt down on the damp floorboards, his tool belt rattling as he began inspecting a heavily rotted section near the eave, his flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the dark, swirling dust motes. He worked methodically, prying away the swollen, ruined timber to assess the structural damage beneath, completely absorbed in the physical labor until a strange, urgent scratching sound drew his attention away from his tools. Charlie had wandered into a narrow, shadowed corner where the roof sloped down aggressively against the floor, his massive paws digging fiercely at a loose, unpainted wooden plank that was deliberately hidden behind a stack of old, empty crates. The dog was breathing heavily, his tail low and focused, his sharp claws making a loud, hollow scraping sound as he tore at the ancient wood with an uncharacteristic intensity that made David's heart skip a beat. David called out to him, but Charlie refused to budge, instead looking back over his shoulder with an intense, pleading stare that practically begged his master to come closer and see. Sensing the dog's unusual urgency, David crawled across the dusty joists, gently pushing Charlie aside and placing his large hands onto the edges of the hidden, unfastened floorboard. With a firm, upward pull that protested with a loud, splintering groan, David ripped the plank away from its joists, exposing a deep, hollow cavity that had remained sealed in absolute darkness for nearly 40 years. Deep inside the hidden recess sat a heavy, rectangular object covered in a thick layer of gray dust and spider webs. A rusted, vintage iron mailbox that looked entirely out of place beneath the bones of the house. David's hands trembled slightly as he reached into the dark hole, his fingers brushing against the cold, flaking metal as he carefully lifted the heavy mailbox out into the beam of his flashlight. The latch was stiff and coated in orange rust, resisting his touch with a stubborn finality. But David pressed down with his thumb until the lock gave way with a sharp metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped attic. Inside the mailbox lay a neat, thick stack of letters, tied together securely with a faded piece of twine, their envelopes yellowed and stained by time, but otherwise perfectly intact and entirely unread. David untied the string with numb fingers, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes scanned the elegant, sweeping handwriting on the top envelope. recognizing the name of the sender instantly. They were all addressed to him, spanning across his childhood, his teenage years, and even his deployment overseas, and every single one was signed by his maternal grandfather, Henry, writing from a distant, forgotten corner of the Appalachian Valley. David's hands shook violently as he tore open the oldest envelope, his eyes devouring the words written by an old man who had desperately pleaded to be part of his grandson's life, offering love, a home, and a final legacy in a grand woodshop by a beautiful emerald pool. As David read through the chronological stack, the horrifying, suffocating truth began to dawn upon him, piercing through his chest with a pain far more devastating than any physical wound he had ever received. His own biological father, a man defined by a brutal, unyielding pride and a cruel, possessive selfishness, had intentionally intercepted and hidden every single one of these letters, systematically cutting David off from his maternal family. His father had buried these lifelines in the dark, choosing to let David grow up believing he was entirely unwanted by his mother's side, carrying that heavy lie until the day his father died. David fell back against the dusty beams, the letters fluttering in his weak grip as hot, bitter tears finally broke through his rugged exterior, his chest heaving with silent, agonizing sobs. Charlie immediately pressed his massive chest against David's trembling frame, his dark eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding as he began to gently lick the phantom echoes of pain and the tears from his master's face. In the suffocating darkness of the old attic, surrounded by the ghosts of his stolen past, David realized that the deepest wounds are not the things we lose to time, but the beautiful truths deliberately kept from us in the shadows, buried under the false name of love. The heavy summer humidity broke violently as a midnight thunderstorm swept down from the mountain ridges, unleashing a fierce deluge that rattled the tin roof of the old family house. Black, churning clouds completely swallowed the moon, split open every few seconds by jagged streaks of blue lightning that illuminated the stark, weeping trees outside in flashes of ghostly white. Inside the cramped living room, the sudden deafening crack of thunder directly overhead struck David Rowan like a physical blow, instantly shattering the fragile defense mechanisms of his mind. The opened letters from his maternal grandfather, Henry, lay scattered across the worn coffee table, their yellowed edges glowing faintly under the dim lamp, acting as a quiet testament to a stolen lifetime. David sat paralyzed on the edge of the old sofa, his chest tightening into a suffocating knot as the boundaries between the safety of the present and the horrors of his past erased themselves in a matter of seconds. The heavy roll of thunder transformed in his ears into the distant, rhythmic pounding of heavy artillery, and the smell of the ozone and rain in the room morphed into the phantom scent of burning cordite from a battlefield he had desperately tried to leave behind. He stared down at his stiff, calloused fingers, completely frozen by a wave of grief and fury so intense it threatened to stop his heart. The dark betrayal of his biological father, compounding the phantom echoes of his post-traumatic stress disorder. As the wind slammed against the rattling window panes, the overwhelming panic dragged David backward through time, trapping him in a vivid, bitter flashback of his childhood that felt entirely real. He was 10 years old again, his smaller frame shivering in a damp bedroom, his young mind still deeply traumatized after miraculously surviving a catastrophic local coal mine collapse that had buried him in total darkness for nearly 2 days. That horrific event had left the young boy with an absolute terror-filled phobia of loud noises, causing him to weep and cower beneath his blankets whenever a summer storm rolled through the valley. In the depths of that memory, the heavy wooden bedroom door was violently flung open, revealing the towering, imposing silhouette of his biological father, Arthur Rowan. Arthur was a severe, rigid man in his mid-40s, possessing a harsh, unyielding jawline, perpetually covered in a rough, dark stubble, and cold, calculating gray eyes that viewed any display of human emotion as a dangerous, systemic flaw. A career military officer who had returned from his own deployments with an icy, ironclad devotion to discipline, Arthur brooked no weakness in his household, his voice carrying the booming resonance of an absolute tyrant. Instead of offering a comforting embrace to his sobbing son, Arthur's massive, calloused hand flew out, violently snatching the young boy by his flannel collar and dragging him off the bed, his boots thudding heavily against the floorboards. He hauled the terrified child out onto the windswept, rain-drenched porch of the old house, forcing him to stand barefaced against the howling wind and blinding lightning while the freezing rain soaked through his pajamas. Arthur shouted fiercely over the roaring thunder, his fingers gripping David's small shoulders like iron clamps, commanding him to look directly into the storm. Arthur roared that a Rowan possessed no room for weakness, that the world was a battlefield, and to survive, a man had to be as unyielding and hard as iron. That brutal, unforgiving harshness had stripped David of his childhood, forcing him to bury his raw terror deep in the absolute darkness of his soul, molding him into a highly disciplined, flawless soldier who could survive any conflict, but leaving him with a heart that was completely shattered beneath the armor. The agonizing memory faded, snapping David back to the dark living room, his skin drenched in a cold sweat as a profound, choking wave of remorse washed over him. He realized with terrible clarity that for his entire adult life, he had misdirected his quiet anger, harboring a deep resentment toward his maternal grandfather Henry, for apparently abandoning him, when in reality Henry had been desperately fighting to reach him from afar. The sheer weight of this injustice created a suffocating deadlock in David's soul. He felt a burning, desperate urgency to pack his tools into his old truck and drive into the Appalachian Valley to find the remaining pieces of Henry's legacy. Yet a crushing guilt held him firmly in place. He looked toward the adjacent hallway, knowing that his elderly grandfather Frank was sleeping just a few doors away, his fragile health declining with each passing season. David could not bear the thought of leaving the gentle old man who had given him a sanctuary when the rest of society had cast him aside, torn between the duty of a grandson to a dying man and the desperate cry of his own broken past. Through the suffocating darkness of this internal storm, a gentle wet warmth pressed firmly against David's cold right hand, breaking the terrifying hold of the panic attack. Charlie, his massive German shepherd, had quietly moved across the room, his black and tan coat shimmering in the dim light as he nudged David's palm with his broad, velvety snout. Sensing that the phantom terrors were still holding his master captive, Charlie performed a familiar, light-hearted routine that he reserved only for David's darkest moments. The giant dog turned around, padded over to the entryway, and carefully picked up an old, tattered foam slipper in his massive jaws, returning to drop the ridiculous object directly into David's lap with a quiet, muffled grunt. Charlie then nudged the slipper forward with his nose, his intelligent amber eyes gleaming with a stubborn, playful mischief that stood in perfect defiance of the roaring thunder outside. It was a simple, grounding act of pure devotion, an intentional distraction designed to force David to look away from the shadows and anchor himself back to the reality of the living room floor. David looked down at the tattered slipper, a faint, tired smile finally breaking through his thick beard as he buried his hand into Charlie's thick, soft fur, drawing strength from the dog's steady, rhythmic heartbeat. A gentle, dry hand wrapped softly around David's tense shoulder, announcing the silent arrival of Frank, who had quietly stepped into the living room, his faded blue eyes filled with an infinite, ancient understanding. The old man sat down slowly on the sofa beside his grandson, his bowed frame leaning close as he pulled David into a soft, stabilizing embrace, completely unfazed by the roaring storm outside. Frank spoke in his quiet, raspy voice, his tone cutting through the darkness with the absolute authority of a man who had survived his own share of family tragedies. Frank whispered that a grandchild's devotion was never meant to be a heavy chain that locked them in the past, assuring David that while Arthur had forced him to wear iron armor, Henry had spent a lifetime building a sanctuary where David was finally allowed to be human. He looked at the scattered letters on the table, a gentle smile crinkling the worn skin around his eyes, and firmly told David to go find the missing pieces of his soul in the Appalachian Valley. Frank promised that he would remain here, tending to the old workshop and guarding the home fires, waiting patiently for the day that David and Charlie would return home whole. The early morning fog rolled thick and heavy off the jagged blue ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, swallowing the twisting mountain pass in a sea of impenetrable white. Shivering pines, slick with dense condensation, lined the narrow asphalt road like towering, ghostly sentinels, their needles whispering sharply whenever a sudden, frigid gust of wind swept through the dense canopy. Inside the cramped cab of the scuffed, faded blue pickup truck, the low, mechanical rumble of the struggling engine vied with the high-pitched hiss of the wind leaking through the worn rubber seals. David Rowan directed his gaze strictly toward the gray emptiness ahead, maintaining a calculated, ironclad posture behind the wheel to combat the exhaustion weighing down his broad shoulders. He wore his iconic beige canvas jacket, the stiff fabric protecting him from the damp chill of the high altitude, as he drove deeper into the unfamiliar territory. The initial calm of the journey began to fade as the steep, winding ascent into the deep wilderness required absolute concentration. The endless, repetitive drone of the tires against the wet asphalt blurring the passage of time, the violent, whistling wind outside constantly mimicked the familiar, terrifying rush of incoming mortars, triggering a sudden, agonizing surge of hypervigilance that narrowed his vision and disrupted his breathing. The internal pressure built rapidly beneath his ribs, his heart hammering in full rebellion against the quiet environment of the truck cabin as the heavy mist outside grew increasingly oppressive. The suffocating grip of the panic attack threatened to lock his muscles entirely, forcing his mind to drift back to the bitter day of his military discharge. He remembered standing at a desolate gray bus depot, a broken man arriving with little more than a duffel bag filled with torn uniforms, a shattered mind, and an absolute absence of hope. Society had viewed his severe post-traumatic stress disorder as a volatile liability, forcing him into a dark, self-destructive isolation, where the loud echoes of combat made it impossible to function. It was his gentle grandfather Frank who had driven through a blinding storm to rescue him from that urban abyss, bringing him back to the quiet sanctuary of the country workshop. David remembered his first week back, his body completely paralyzed by phantom fears, convinced that he was entirely useless to the world until Frank placed a heavy, vintage steel hand plane into his hands. Covering David's calloused fingers with his own warm, steady palms, Frank had whispered that the wood didn't care about a man's past, teaching him to shave away his inner demons piece by piece until he could stand proud as a working-class carpenter. The vivid memory of that stabilizing love faded, but the intense physical pressure of the current flashback remained, causing his foot to waver dangerously against the accelerator pedal as the truck navigated a treacherous, unguarded cliffside curve. Sensing the immediate danger and the sudden spike in his master's heart rate, Charlie, the majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, sitting on the worn vinyl passenger seat, swung his powerful body into action. The dog did not whine or retreat in fear. Instead, he leaned his massive chest forward across the center console, pressing his thick, jet black and tan coat firmly against David's rigid right side. Charlie stretched his neck upward, deliberately burying his warm, velvety snout directly under David's jawline, using his own massive body weight to physically pin his master back against the seat. He let out a series of rhythmic, low, patient snorts against David's neck, a grounding technique he had practiced 1,000 times in the dark, deliberately forcing the veteran to synchronize his shallow breathing with the dog's own deep, steady respirations. The soothing warmth of Charlie's thick fur acted as a living shield against the phantom terrors of the fog, an unyielding anchor of pure loyalty, reminding David that he was no longer alone on the battlefield of his mind. Slowly, the intense tightness in David's chest began to subside, his muscles relaxing as the soothing rhythm of Charlie's breath pulled him back into the reality of the truck cab. He reached out with his right hand, burying his fingers deeply behind Charlie's soft ears, a silent nod of profound gratitude passing between the man and his faithful canine companion. The impenetrable mountain mist outside remained just as thick and unforgiving as before, completely obscuring the path toward the grand woodshop by the emerald pool, but the suffocating darkness inside David's soul had finally cleared. Together, the solitary veteran and his unwavering German shepherd rode deeper into the white heart of the ancient wilderness, moving forward as a unified team, perfectly content to face the unknown dangers of the journey as long as they had each other. The thick mountain mist parted abruptly as the old blue pickup truck came to a final halt in the isolated basin of the Appalachian Valley, revealing a timeless landscape touched by the golden warmth of the afternoon sun. Nestled deep within the emerald wilderness, a colossal weathered wooden house, its roof entirely blanketed in rich green moss, sat physically anchored directly over the gaping mouth of an ancient limestone cave. Beneath this natural stone archway, a pristine, jade-green lake shimmered silently, its glassy surface dappled with floating duckweed and bordered by a dense, snow-white carpet of wild daisies that swayed gently in the mountain breeze. Directly adjacent to the cavern opening stood a magnificent giant wooden water wheel, its massive timber body frozen in time, with several broken slats fractured like missing teeth, telling a silent story of decades of abandonment and neglect. Stepping out of the vehicle into the crisp, fragrant mountain air, the veteran felt an immediate, uncharacteristic sense of profound stillness settle over his broad shoulders, as if the valley itself were welcoming him home. Charlie leapt gracefully from the passenger side, his thick tail wagging low and focused as his sharp amber eyes scanned the perimeter, his nose twitching to absorb the new sense of the historic property. Together, the solitary carpenter and his majestic German shepherd walked toward the heavy oak front door of the ancient structure, which yielded to David's large, calloused hand with a long, echoing groan of rusted hinges. Inside the sprawling estate, the heavy scent of aged pine and dried lavender hung thick in the air, creating a sanctuary where time seemed to have frozen completely since the moment his maternal grandfather, Henry, had passed away. David walked methodically through the dusty hallway until his instincts led him to a heavy, unpainted timber door at the very back of the structure, which opened into Henry's private sanctuary and master workshop. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal light filtering through a large, grime-covered bay window, illuminating a massive, sturdily built oak workbench that occupied the center of the floor space. Charlie immediately trotted over to the desk, sniffing the perimeter with great intensity, before suddenly lowering his massive chest to the floor and sliding his snout entirely underneath the bottom shelf. The dog let out a sharp, demanding huff, his powerful paws tapping against a hidden floor panel, forcing David to kneel down into the thick dust beside his faithful companion. Reaching deep beneath the heavy frame of the workbench, David's fingers brushed against a long, heavy cylindrical object, a vintage weathered copper tube sealed tightly with a threaded brass cap. With a firm twist of his calloused hands, David unscrewed the oxidized cap and slid out a thick, beautifully preserved roll of heavy parchment paper, revealing a highly detailed, hand-drawn blueprint of the giant wooden water wheel outside. But as David unrolled the mechanical drawings on the dusty table, his eyes drifted toward a dim, recessed corner of the room, and his breath caught sharply in his chest as a sudden wave of intense emotion threatened to overwhelm his composure. There, arranged with painstaking care on a dark oak mantel, sat a deeply personal shrine of memory that Henry had constructed in absolute secrecy, dedicated entirely to the grandson he was never permitted to see. Upon the shelf lay a series of tiny, heartbreaking artifacts from David's lost childhood, his very first baby tooth, carefully wrapped in a scrap of faded crimson velvet, and a crumpled elementary school drawing with a crude 10 marked in red ink, preserved inside a hand-carved wooden frame. In the center of the mantel sat a small, faded black and white photograph of an 8-year-old David, his younger face split into a wide, radiant smile as he hugged a scruffy, tiny puppy against his chest, a stark contrast to the hardened, scarred veteran standing in the room today. With steady but cautious fingers, David lifted the fragile glass frame, turning it over to find a paragraph of elegant, sweeping handwriting covering the back of the photograph, the ink slightly blurred and smeared by ancient tears. Henry's written words cut through decades of forced isolation. "My dearest David, no matter how many letters your father intercepts and burns, no matter how many walls of pride he builds between us, you will always remain the most precious grain of timber God ever granted to my life. I am building this acoustic water wheel for you, designed so that the precise melody of the rushing mountain water and the wind through the slats will create a deep, soothing chord to quiet your childhood terror of the thunder." The sheer weight of this ancient, unyielding love hit David with the force of a tidal wave, causing his legs to give way as he collapsed heavily onto his knees against the solid oak floorboards. He pulled the fragile photograph tightly against his broad chest, his large shoulders shaking violently as a torrent of hot, cathartic tears broke through his rugged exterior, washing away decades of bitter resentment and phantom echoes of loneliness. Through his tears, a profound clarity illuminated the tragic history of his family, allowing him to finally comprehend the agonizing conflict between the two men who had shaped his destiny. His biological father, Arthur, had been a brutal, traumatized soldier who fiercely believed that the only way to ensure his son's survival in a cruel world was through the imposition of unyielding discipline and iron armor. In contrast, his grandfather Henry had believed in the gentle, healing sanctuary of nature, dedicating his final years to constructing a magnificent acoustic miracle designed to soothe the young boy's hidden fears through the power of love. This deep revelation acted as a powerful solvent, dissolving the tight knot of hatred that David had harbored toward his deceased father for 40 years. Realizing that both men had loved him in their own flawed, fiercely protective ways, Charlie immediately closed the distance between them, pressing his massive warm chest firmly against David's shaking frame, his intelligent amber eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful empathy as he rested his heavy head upon his master's shoulder. Wrapped in the quiet embrace of his loyal dog and surrounded by the tangible proof of a love that had survived the grave, the hardened soldier finally shed his heavy armor, his soul anchoring itself to a new mission of healing and redemption in the heart of the Appalachian Valley. The serene afternoon tranquility shattered instantly as a catastrophic mountain flash flood, typical of the unforgiving Appalachian topography, erupted from the high ridges with terrifying ferocity. A monstrous wall of chocolate-brown water, choked with uprooted pine trees, jagged boulders, and churning mud, roared down the narrow valley crevices, its deep subsonic bass shaking the bedrock of the valley and instantly swallowing the wild daisy fields in a violent surge. The fragile mountain streams, oversaturated by days of continuous downpours on the peaks above, transformed into high-velocity torrents that carved away the ancient topsoil, hurtling directly toward the isolated basin where the historic family property stood. The natural peace of the emerald wilderness dissolved beneath a terrifying acoustic roar, a deafening combination of grinding stone and rushing water that vibrated through the crisp mountain air like an oncoming freight train. Inside the old wooden structure, the deafening thunder of the ongoing landslide slamming against the ancient limestone cave below buckled the oak floorboards, pushing David Rowan's post-traumatic stress disorder into an absolute pinnacle of unmanageable panic. The continuous explosive cracks of fracturing timber and colliding boulders directly beneath the house mimicked the exact, rhythmic cadence of a heavy artillery bombardment on a forgotten battlefield, completely wiping out his connection to reality. The sudden structural groaning of the building, coupled with the violent vibrations under his feet, triggered an immediate sensory overload that forced his vision to blur and narrow into a terrifying tunnel. David collapsed into a dark, shadowed corner of Henry's master workshop, his large frame tightly curled into a defensive fetal position as his chest seized under the sudden weight of a severe hyperventilation episode. His calloused fingers tore frantically at the stiff canvas of his beige jacket, his mind entirely detached from the geographical reality of the mountain valley and trapped within the phantom horrors of a war zone. He was no longer a civilian carpenter. He was a vulnerable soldier caught in an open trench, his ears ringing with the imaginary screams of fallen comrades and the concussive pressure of heavy ordnance detonating all around him. He stared out with wide, blank gray-blue eyes at the rapidly rising floodwaters that tore through the lower foundation vents, dark and swirling mud engulfing the historic workbenches, symbols of a newfound hope now seemingly drowned in absolute ruin. The freezing mountain water began to lap hungrily at the edges of the wooden floorboards, the dark, muddy surface carrying fragments of raw lumber and forgotten tools from the outer yard. The sheer velocity of the disaster left him completely incapacitated, his physical strength as a laborer rendered utterly useless against the overwhelming weight of his psychological trauma. The dark water rose inches by inches within minutes, reflecting the jagged flashes of lightning outside, creating a claustrophobic cage of shadow and debris that offered no apparent avenue of escape for the paralyzed veteran. Amidst this terrifying boundary between life and death, Charlie, his majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, refused to succumb to the chaos of the encroaching flood or the frozen paralysis of his master. The powerful dog stood directly at the edge of the collapsing cellar hatch, his thick black and tan coat drenched and matted with mud, his intelligent amber eyes burning with an intense, unyielding survival instinct that defied the roar of the mountain. He understood the lethal mechanics of the rising water far better than the traumatized human, his acute senses identifying the structural failure of the outer retaining walls before they completely gave way. With a fierce, echoing bark that pierced through the deafening din of the landslide, Charlie deliberately plunged into the churning, chest-deep waters, swirling within the lower limestone cavern, his powerful legs fighting the treacherous currents as he swam deeper into the darkness. David, startled out of his catatonic state by the desperate echoing cries of his faithful companion, grabbed his heavy tactical flashlight from the workbench and crawled frantically toward the gaping hatch, the brilliant white beam cutting through the damp, swirling mist of the subterranean void. The raw dread of losing the only living being that truly anchored him to this earth shattered the icy grip of his panic attack, forcing his muscles to move through pure adrenaline. He descended the shaking wooden steps into the flooded basement, his heavy boots splashing into the icy deluge that instantly numbed his legs, the turbulent current pulling aggressively at his waist as he pushed forward. He swung the flashlight beam across the weeping stone walls, shouting Charlie's name into the roaring echo chamber until he finally located the dog, balanced precariously on a slick limestone ledge deep inside the cavern's western wall. The dog was breathing heavily, his jaws coated in wet grit, and his front paws covered in deep scratches as he fiercely tore away at a dense layer of rotting roots and loose slate that plugged a narrow, hidden crevice in the ancient stone. As David directed the intense beam of his flashlight onto the area, he realized with utter amazement that Charlie had uncovered a meticulously engineered, subterranean emergency escape route that tunneled upward through the solid rock toward the high hill crest above. This hidden passage was not a random formation of nature. It was a reinforced rescue shaft lined with sturdy ancient locust timbers, a life-saving contingency that his maternal grandfather, Henry, had calculated and built decades ago into the disaster readiness blueprints of the estate. Henry had anticipated the violent temper of the mountain streams, using his profound knowledge of structural engineering to carve a path of salvation directly through the mountain's bones, leaving a silent answer to a question David had only just begun to ask. Urged on by Charlie's demanding huffs and sharp nudges against his knee, David squeezed his broad shoulders into the narrow timber-frame shaft, hauling his heavy frame upward through the dark, wet earth, while the dog climbed directly behind him, his powerful hindquarters pushing his master forward whenever David's grip slipped on the muddy roots. The climb was a brutal test of endurance, the narrow confines forcing them to crawl on their bellies through suffocating layers of cold mud and sharp gravel, while the roaring water below filled the shaft with a terrifying echo of destruction. They clawed their way through the suffocating darkness of the mountain's belly, fighting for every inch of oxygen, their movements driven by a shared, unbreakable instinct to survive that bound man and animal into a single entity. After what felt like hours of agonizing labor, their hands and paws tearing at the stubborn clay, they finally burst through a concealed wooden hatch hidden beneath a dense thicket of briars, tumbling out onto the windswept, barren summit of the high hill, just as the lower valley house groaned beneath the weight of the massive debris field. Clutching the completely soaked parchment blueprints tightly against his chest, David sat shivering on the muddy earth of the exposed hill crest, the freezing wind whipping rain across his face as a powerful transformative shift began to ignite within his fractured psychology. He looked down at Charlie, who lay panting heavily beside him, the dog's massive body shaking uncontrollably from the freezing mountain water. Yet, his amber eyes remained locked onto David with an unyielding, protective vigilance that refused to waver even in exhaustion. David looked away from his dog and gazed down at the waterlogged drawings in his hands, carefully tracing the faint, sweeping ink lines of Henry's handwriting that had miraculously survived the fury of the storm, and a profound realization pierced through the fog of his trauma. This historic woodshop and the massive acoustic water wheel below were not merely an impressive display of working-class craftsmanship. They represented a massive, living fortress of love that his grandfather had painstakingly built during his loneliest decades, a protective shield sent across time to shelter a grandson he might never live to hold. Henry had poured his entire soul into these stones and timbers, calculating every flood level and emergency exit for David's survival, sending this lifeline into an uncertain future without ever receiving a single word of confirmation or gratitude from the child he loved. The old man had labored in absolute isolation, driven only by the faint hope that one day, when the world became too loud and dangerous for his grandson, this hidden sanctuary would stand ready to save his life. The sheer depth of this enduring, time-transcending devotion sparked a blazing fire within David's chest, burning away the remaining shackles of his self-pity and paralyzing fear. He reached up, wiping away the bitter mixture of mud and tears from his bearded face with a firm, deliberate motion, his large calloused hands slowly tightening into hard, iron-like fists. He looked down at the flooded valley below, and knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer sit in the shadows of his past, waiting for the storms of life to destroy him. He had to live, he had to be strong, and he would rebuild every broken slat of that water wheel to fulfill the sacred wish of the man who had loved him from the dark. The devastating morning sun rose over the battered Appalachian Basin, casting a harsh, revealing light on the receding floodwaters and fields of ruined daisies. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the mud-slicked valley, broken only by the squelch of heavy, deliberate boots stepping through the debris near the high hill crest. Emerging from the shadow of the wet pine trees was Silas Vance, the eccentric 74-year-old local land guardian who had fiercely protected the valley's borders for nearly 3 decades. Silas was a striking, weathering force of a man. Though his frame was naturally lean and angular, his broad shoulders were cloaked in a heavy, grease-stained, oilskin duster coat that seemed to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. His face was a deeply grooved landscape of sharp edges, defined by a jagged, broken nose, a thick white mustache that aggressively covered his upper lip, and a pair of piercing, dark charcoal eyes that glared out from beneath the frayed brim of his prized vintage brown felt fedora hat. Silas was known by the scattered mountain folks as a bitter, reclusive hermit, a reputation earned after a devastating timber mill accident in his youth had taken his right index finger and left him distrustful of the outside world, causing him to treat all strangers with a volatile, defensive hostility. In his left hand, clamped tightly against his hip like a weapon, he carried a thick, water-resistant leather portfolio containing the ancient trust funds and deed records of Henry's historical woodshop. He stopped a few paces from the shivering veteran, his dark eyes instantly locking onto the intense physical tremors still racking David's broad shoulders and the desperate white-knuckle grip the soldier maintained on the waterlogged blueprints. Silas scoffed loudly, stepping forward until the shadow of his fedora fell directly across David's bearded face, his raspy voice cutting through the crisp mountain air like a rusty saw blade. He looked down his sharp nose, gesturing with the leather portfolio toward David's shaking fingers, and unleashed a barrage of cruel, calculated challenges designed to break the younger man's spirit. Silas growled fiercely, stating that Henry Vance was an absolute master of the craft, whose hands could shape the wind into music, while the man standing before him was nothing more than a broken, disabled soldier whose hands were permanently ruined by the ghosts of a forgotten war. He tossed a heavy envelope filled with emergency relocation cash onto the muddy hood of the ruined pickup truck, commanding David to take the money and leave the valley immediately, claiming that a traumatized veteran had no right to defile a refined sacred legacy with hands that couldn't even remain steady in a morning breeze. The tense atmosphere on the hill crest tightened into a suffocating deadlock as David refused to launch into an angry argument or retreat into the protective shadow of his self-pity. Instead, he maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact with the hostile old man, his gray-blue eyes burning with the quiet fury of a soldier who had faced far worse terrors in open combat than bitter words. David slowly knelt down, his muscles locking with intense military discipline as he reached into the mud to grasp the heavy handle of a weathered felling axe that had washed ashore near his boots. His broad shoulders continued to shake violently from the freezing mountain wind and the residual adrenaline of his post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet, as his fingers wrapped around the hickory wood, a profound transformation occurred within his posture. He carried the bloodline of Henry and the iron discipline of Arthur. He understood that survival was not about eliminating the storm, but about maintaining absolute focus while the storm raged around you. With a slow, deliberate breath that stabilized his racing pulse, David swung the heavy iron blade upward, his entire physical universe shrinking down to a single, wet oak log that lay split by the flood directly in front of Silas's muddy boots. Despite the visible tremors running through his forearms, David delivered a single, explosive downward strike that cut through the roaring wind with a terrifying rhythmic precision. The razor-sharp iron blade slammed into the exact center of the waterlogged oak log, dividing the dense timber into 2 perfectly symmetrical halves down to the exact millimeter before embedding itself deeply into the earth beneath. The absolute silence that followed the concussive strike was deafening. The sheer, undeniable display of perfect working-class craftsmanship and military focus, leaving Silas completely stunned, his mustache twitching in absolute disbelief. David stood up slowly, his breathing deep and regulated as he left the axe embedded in the wood, a silent statement that his lineage and his worth were not things that could be bought or bartered away by a bitter old man. Right at that explosive climax of tension, Charlie, the majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, executed a brilliant, light-hearted tactical maneuver that shattered the heavy hostility of the encounter. Recognizing that the human standoff required an immediate grounding intervention, the large dog quietly slithered behind Silas's oilskin duster coat, his matted black and tan fur moving invisibly through the briars. With a sudden, lightning-fast extension of his powerful jaws, Charlie reached upward and neatly snatched the vintage brown felt fedora directly off Silas's sun-spotted scalp, without leaving a single scratch on the old man's skin. The giant dog let out a joyful, muffled huff through the brim of the hat, spinning on his hind legs and launching into a playful, chaotic sprint down the muddy hillside toward the edge of the jade-green lake. Silas let out a high-pitched, furious yelp of absolute shock, his severe armor completely dissolving as he threw his arms into the air, his bald head gleaming in the sun as he chased after the mischievous canine. The old hermit scrambled wildly through the mud, cursing and waving his hands while Charlie kept a safe, tantalizing distance of 5 feet, glancing back with amber eyes full of pure, unadulterated defiance and playful mockery. David stood watch from the top of the hill, a genuine booming laugh finally breaking through his thick beard for the first time in decades as he watched the ridiculous therapeutic chase around the wild daisy fields. Silas finally collapsed against a boulder by the lake, panting heavily as Charlie trotted over and gently dropped the muddy fedora directly onto the old man's lap, shaking his matted coat with a proud, rhythmic thud. Looking at the brilliant, spirited animal, and then up at the unwavering, dignified stance of the veteran on the crest, Silas's chest began to heave, his harsh exterior crumbling as a sudden, wheezing laugh escaped his throat, accompanied by a rare tear that slipped down his weathered cheek. The old guardian slowly climbed back up the hill, his raspy voice dropping into a quiet, reverent tone as he stepped into David's personal space and extended the heavy leather portfolio with a hand that was finally open. Silas admitted softly that Henry had chosen the right man after all, confessing that he had guarded these trust documents in absolute, agonizing loneliness for 30 years, waiting for the valley to rot away into oblivion. He looked David in the eyes, his dark eyes shining with a profound, newfound respect, as he explained that his cruel challenge was never an inspection of David's technical skill, but a desperate test of his spiritual resilience. Silas whispered that the Appalachian Valley had been dead and silent for too long since the young generation had abandoned their roots, and that the mountains desperately needed a man who possessed the courage to stay, to fight the storms, and to breathe a beautiful new soul into the ancient timber. Wrapped in the warm sunlight filtering through the pines, David held the deed to his new future, his heart ready to rebuild what was lost. The amber rays of late summer sunshine pierced through the dusty clear-story windows of the historic master workshop, illuminating millions of golden sawdust particles floating lazily in the warm air. The scent of raw oak, freshly shaved pine, and Leonixan resin completely filled the massive timber structure, replacing the sour odor of stagnant river mud as the rhythmic metallic scrape of drawing knives signaled the beginning of a massive resurrection. Standing over a freshly cut trunk of a majestic white oak, David Rowan adjusted the heavy leather apron over his beige canvas jacket, his large, calloused fingers gripping the handles of his vintage draw knife with focused, professional intent. He had officially claimed his maternal grandfather Henry's legacy, but the physical reality of rebuilding the colossal, broken water wheel was a brutal, exhausting labor that tested the absolute limits of his endurance and spiritual resolve. Each individual slat for the giant water wheel required meticulous shaping, calling for a perfect uniform curvature that could only be achieved through hours of agonizing manual shaving against the stubborn, wet grain of the mountain timber. As the afternoon progressed and the ambient heat rose within the workshop, the sheer physical strain combined with the deep, haunting fatigue of his mind, causing the familiar, agonizing physical tremors of his post-traumatic stress disorder to creep back into his forearms. He froze mid-stroke, his muscles locking in rigid frustration as his gray-blue eyes stared down at the uncontrollable shaking of his calloused hands. A wave of familiar, self-destructive despair threatening to choke his breathing. He felt like an imposter among these sacred tools, convinced that a broken, traumatized working-class soldier had no right to attempt the flawless, symphonic carpentry that his legendary grandfather had mastered. Right at that critical precipice of frustration, a rhythmic hollow sound began to echo clearly against the solid oak floorboards just a few feet beneath the workbench, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. Charlie, his majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, had adjusted his massive black and tan body on the concrete floor, deliberately resting his heavy chin upon his front paws while his thick, powerful tail began to thud systematically against a loose oak plank. The sound was crisp, heavy, and perfectly uniform, echoing through the master workshop with the deliberate, unyielding cadence of an organic metronome. Charlie's deep amber eyes remained fixed on his master's face, entirely devoid of panic or judgment, radiating instead an absolute, unwavering belief that was grounded in years of shared survival on the battlefield of David's mind. The precise, comforting rhythm of the dog's tail functioned as a powerful sensory anchor, giving the hyperventilating veteran a tactile, predictable beat to synchronize his shallow respirations against, forcing his racing pulse to slow down step by step. David closed his eyes, drawing the crisp mountain air deep into his lungs with every echo of Charlie's tail against the timber, allowing the pure, unadulterated loyalty of his canine companion to wash away the phantom screams of his war trauma. As David opened his eyes and successfully resumed his work, his steadying hands guiding the iron blade smoothly along the oak trunk, a soft murmur of voices at the threshold announced the arrival of the valley's forgotten residents. Drawn by the unfamiliar, persistent sounds of industry returning to the historic estate, a small, tentative group of local onlookers had gathered outside the massive open double doors of the workshop. Among them were several impoverished mountain children with dirt-smudged cheeks and oversized, hand-me-down flannel shirts, their eyes wide with intense curiosity as they watched the giant German shepherd and the rugged carpenter working in perfect harmony. Standing slightly behind the children was a solitary man named Thomas Miller, a 38-year-old local veteran who had returned to the Appalachian Valley after a devastating deployment overseas that had left him physically and emotionally shattered. Thomas was a tall, painfully thin man with a hollow, gaunt face defined by a jagged shrapnel scar running from his left temple down to a rough, neglected dark brown beard that couldn't completely hide the nervous twitching of his jawline. His deeply recessed dark brown eyes held the unmistakable, hyper-vigilant glaze of severe combat fatigue. His slumped shoulders wrapped in a frayed, military-issue field jacket that he kept tightly buttoned against the warm summer air, as if it were an iron shield against the civilian world. Thomas stood in absolute silence, his rough hands buried deeply inside his pockets, his entire defensive posture reflecting the deep, self-destructive isolation that had consumed David's own life before he uncovered his grandfather's letters. David Zip paused his stroke, his gray-blue eyes meeting Thomas's guarded, hyper-vigilant gaze, recognizing the invisible, heavy shroud of wartime trauma instantly because it was the exact same demon he wrestled with every single morning. Instead of retreating into his own comfortable shell of isolation or treating the strangers with hostility, David took a deep, steadying breath, looked down at the perfectly shaped oak slat in front of him, and made a conscious, deliberate choice to open his heart. He did not offer empty, superficial words of comfort. Instead, he stepped away from the workbench, picked up a spare, vintage wooden hand plane, and extended the heavy working-class tool toward Thomas with an open, welcoming gesture. David spoke in his deep, gravelly voice, inviting the younger veteran to step inside the shadow of the historic structure, stating simply that the grain of the white oak was far too stubborn for a single man to conquer alone. Thomas froze, his jawline twitching violently as he stared at the extended tool, a deep, silent conflict visible in his dark eyes before the comforting, rhythmic thump of Charlie's tail against the floorboards broke his paralysis. The broken soldier stepped across the threshold, his boots clicking softly on the dust, and as his scarred fingers wrapped around the smooth, familiar hickory handle of the hand plane, a visible shudder of relief passed through his thin frame. Within hours, the ancient master workshop transformed from a desolate, ghost-filled ruin into a thriving sanctuary of mutual healing, shared labor, and profound working-class redemption. David moved methodically between the workbenches, using the patient, honest principles of carpentry that his grandfather Frank had taught him to guide Thomas and two other quiet, disabled veterans who had crawled out of the valley's shadows. He showed them how to look at a rough, knot-filled block of timber, not as a ruined piece of waste, but as a valuable entity that required patient, deliberate chiseling and shaping to reveal its true, hidden inner strength. He explained softly that timber, much like a human soul, had to endure the painful, transformative process of being cut, planed, and carved before it could ever be integrated into a grand acoustic miracle that could withstand the storms. As the sun began to set, casting long, deep purple shadows across the Appalachian hills, the combined sound of multiple tools shaving wood blended beautifully with the laughter of the local children playing with Charlie near the Emerald Lake. Wrapped in the warm camaraderie of his fellow soldiers and looking down at the row of flawlessly crafted water wheel slats, David realized that his grandfather Henry's truest legacy was not the physical woodshop itself, but this living, breathing fortress of love that was finally mending their broken pieces. The crisp autumn air of the Appalachian Valley was violently broken early one morning by the screeching mechanical whine of heavy diesel engines echoing off the high stone ridges. Yellow excavators and flatbed trucks carrying industrial drilling equipment tore through the narrow, mud-slicked entrance of the basin, their heavy treads crushing the remaining patches of wild daisies and leaving deep, black scars across the fragile topsoil. Leading this invasive convoy was Marcus Vance, a cold corporate enforcement representative for a multi-state timber processing corporation, whose biological ties to the valley had long been severed by greed. Marcus was a man in his late 40s, tall and rigidly sharp, with a clinical, unsmiling face defined by a closely shaved jawline, cold slate gray eyes hidden behind rimless glasses, and dark hair meticulously gelled back without a single strand out of place. He wore an expensive charcoal-colored waterproof trench coat over a tailored suit, a stark and patronizing contrast to the rugged canvas jackets of the working-class locals. Marcus was notoriously calculating, known for exploiting legal loopholes to dispossess vulnerable rural families, a ruthless career path solidified years ago when he successfully sold out his own family's local homestead to the highest corporate bidder. Standing beside Marcus was Sarah Jenkins, a high-priced corporate attorney hired to handle the local resistance. Sarah was a tall, remarkably lean woman in her early 40s, with striking pale skin and sharp features. Her fiery copper-red hair pulled back into a severe, tight bun that emphasized the calculating angles of her cheekbones. She carried an elite leather briefcase like a shield, her demeanor icy and superior, treating the gathered mountain folks with a practiced, indifferent condescension. Marcus stepped off his truck and slammed a laminated document onto the hood of David's old blue pickup, coldly announcing a state-sanctioned permit for geological surveying and surface water access rights. Their strategic intent was devastatingly practical. Taking advantage of the Woodshop's decades of abandonment, they planned to legally seize the Jade Green Lake to serve as an industrial waste dumping zone, using intense financial pressure and aggressive legal intimidation to force the elderly, isolated residents into signing away their ancestral lands. The atmosphere by the emerald water tightened into a dangerous, suffocating deadlock as the gathered group of disabled veterans and mountain children began to murmur in helpless anger, their eyes turning instinctively toward David Rowan. David stood like a stone pillar beneath the shadow of the ancient porch, his gray-blue eyes scanning the corporate documents with the cool, analytical precision of a military scout reading an enemy map. He utilized his tactical breathing to maintain an absolute emotional stillness, refusing to let the corporate provocation breach his mental defenses. He understood that a battlefield of laws could not be won with short-sighted physical violence. Silas Vance stepped up beside David, his dark charcoal eyes burning with ancient fury beneath the brim of his brown felt fedora, his left hand holding the thick leather portfolio containing Henry's original trust agreements. Silas whispered in his raspy voice that the corporate permit possessed a single, critical vulnerability. It was entirely conditional on the property remaining classified as an inactive, non-productive agricultural site, a loophole that would close permanently the exact second Henry's acoustic water wheel became an active ecological and cultural asset. With the company's official surveying window scheduled to conclude in exactly 48 hours, David looked toward the giant wooden water wheel, realizing they were locked in an absolute white-knuckle race against time to fashion the final oak slats and bring the dormant giant back to life. For 2 days and 2 nights, without a single moment of sleep, the ancient master workshop transformed into a roaring engine of focused human defiance. David and Thomas Miller worked in flawless, synchronized harmony under the harsh glare of halogen work lights, their drawing knives and chisels carving through the dense white oak with a desperate rhythmic intensity. Charlie sat steadfast at the center of the floor, his massive black and tan body tense, his intelligent amber eyes shifting alertly between the windows and his master, his ears twitching at the distant, threatening hum of the corporate machinery outside. Every time exhaustion threatened to paralyze Thomas's scarred arms, or David's mind began to wander under the heavy weight of sensory overload. The comforting, heavy thump of Charlie's tail against the floorboards acted as an unyielding metronome, grounding them in the reality of their mission. On the final dawn, as the corporate excavators began rolling down the shoreline toward the natural stone archway, David drove the final, precision-cut wooden wedge into the driving shaft of the massive water wheel. With the deafening, splintering groan of ancient timber waking from a 30-year slumber, the colossal wooden wheel began to turn, its massive slat scooping up the pristine, jade-green water and unleashing a deep, booming acoustic harmony that vibrated through the bedrock of the valley like a beautiful symphonic shield. The thunderous musical roar of the rushing water instantly triggered a dormant, ironclad clause within Henry's original heritage trust, an eco-cultural protection mechanism that Silas had secretly filed with the state land office decades ago. The moment the wheel generated measurable ecological water movement, the entire historic estate was automatically reclassified under state law as a protected private cultural heritage zone with sovereign surface water immunities, overriding the corporate surveying permit entirely. When Marcus Vance and Sarah Jenkins marched toward the workshop, backed by a row of roaring heavy machinery, intending to initiate an eviction by force, David quietly stepped out onto the muddy pathway to meet them. He was accompanied by Arthur Pendleton, a respected white-haired local country attorney whom David had quietly retained using a small portion of Henry's trust funds. Arthur Pendleton was a short, stout man in his late 60s with a warm, sun-reddened face, thick wire-rimmed spectacles, and a gentle but unyielding demeanor that radiated the quiet confidence of a man who knew the law inside and out. Without uttering a single word of anger, David calmly extended the newly certified, state-approved legal injunction directly into Marcus's hands, while Arthur Pendleton stepped forward to deliver the official cease-and-desist orders to a stunned Sarah Jenkins. The corporate attorney's icy composure completely shattered as her sharp eyes scanned the state seals on the documents, the rigid lines of her face tightening in shock as she realized that the soldier had completely outmaneuvered her entire corporate legal team. Marcus locked his jaw in a fit of impotent rage, looking up at the roaring, beautiful water wheel before barking a furious order to his operators to put the heavy machinery into reverse and retreat from the basin. As the yellow excavators crawled backward out of the valley, leaving the Emerald Lake pristine and untouched, a roaring cheer erupted from the veterans and children gathered on the hillside, their home protected entirely through the power of strategic wisdom and the rule of law. David knelt down into the mud, burying his calloused hands deep into Charlie's thick fur as the giant dog pressed his warm head against his chest, their victory sweet, legal, and absolute. The crisp, high-altitude breath of early spring swept across the Appalachian Basin, chasing away the remnants of the bitter winter and washing the valley in a brilliant, crystal-clear light. A vibrant canopy of fresh emerald leaves rustled softly against the pale blue sky, their new growth trembling in the energetic wind that carried the rich, earthy fragrance of damp mountain soil and wild flora. Beneath the ancient limestone archway, the giant wooden water wheel spun with a majestic, flawless regularity, its newly carved white oak slats slicing through the pristine, jade-green water like a beautifully orchestrated mechanical dance. The powerful subterranean streams flowing from the deep stone cavern surged directly into the timber buckets, and as the wheel rotated, the complex system of hollowed locust wood tubes and internal sounding chambers transformed the kinetic energy into a deep, acoustic masterpiece. The precise rushing of the mountain water, combined with the high-pitched whistle of the wind flowing through the open timber vents to create a profound, low-frequency symphonic chorus that vibrated through the very bedrock of the ancient wilderness. This rustic, sacred melody, dreamed up by Henry decades ago, functioned as a powerful sensory shield, completely dissolving the lingering shadows of resentment that David Rowan had carried against his deceased father, Arthur. The deep, grounding resonance of the machine completely neutralized the phantom echoes of heavy artillery and wartime trauma within his mind, replacing his long-standing hypervigilance with a permanent, washing wave of absolute psychological peace. This magnificent rebirth extended far beyond the walls of the workshop, flooding the surrounding natural landscape with an explosive wave of ecological vitality. Along the smooth shores of the jade-green lake, the brilliant emerald carpets of duckweed swayed gently in response to the hydraulic currents, while expansive dense ribbons of snow-white wild daisies and vibrant bluebells burst into sudden, radiant bloom. The fine, cool mist generated by the powerful revolutions of the giant water wheel drifted lazily across the valley floor, coating the fragile petals in a nurturing layer of moisture that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. David stood quietly on the moss-covered porch of the historic wooden house, a soft look of pure physical relief softening his rugged features as he watched his 82-year-old paternal grandfather, Frank Rowan, step slowly out of the old blue pickup truck. David rushed forward, his broad shoulders dropping their remaining tension completely as his large calloused hands pulled the frail old man into a soft, protective embrace, officially welcoming him into the warm, timber-scented sanctuary of the Valley House where they would spend their remaining years together. The historic estate rapidly transformed into a thriving, light-hearted sanctuary of human connection, drawing the valley's forgotten residents out of their long-standing isolation to rebuild their fractured lives as a unified community. Thomas Miller worked with focused intent at the primary workbench, his gaunt face softened by a genuine smile as his scarred hands effortlessly guided a vintage handplane along a block of sweet-smelling pine. He was accompanied by several other disabled veterans who had voluntarily traveled from the outer ridges. Their once tense shoulders relaxed as they shared working-class labor, their mutual trauma mended through the honest camaraderie of the workshop floor. The warmth of the community grew even richer with the arrival of Clara Higgins, a 68-year-old mountain matriarch who lived in the remote northern pass of the valley. Clara was a short, pleasantly plump woman with a radiant sun-kissed complexion, kind hazel eyes that crinkled with absolute warmth, and thick silver hair woven into a loose, comfortable braid over her shoulder. She wore a hand-knit woolen shawl over a faded denim apron, her small, flour-dusted hands carrying a large wicker basket filled with steaming, golden-brown blackberry pies that filled the fresh air with a rich, sugary aroma. Clara was a woman of immense resilience, having raised 3 children alone after her husband passed away in a local logging accident. Yet she maintained a gentle maternal generosity that made her the beloved caretaker of the mountain folks. She set her warm basket down on a clean timber bench, offering Frank a soft, respectful nod, before bustling over to hand slices of fresh pie to the hard-working veterans, her cheerful laughter cutting through the historic structure like warm sunlight. Nearby, a lively group of impoverished mountain children gathered along the rocky shoreline, their joyous, high-pitched laughter blending beautifully with the deep, rhythmic drone of the acoustic water wheel and the bright melodies of a wooden dulcimer that Silas Vance played from the porch steps. At the center of this vibrant, healing landscape lay Charlie, the majestic 5-year-old German shepherd, resting comfortably upon a thick, plush carpet of fresh green grass. His jet black and tan coat shimmered brilliantly beneath the heavy, golden warmth of the late afternoon sunset, his intelligent amber eyes reflecting a deep, soulful contentment as his powerful tail thudded systematically against the soft earth in a slow, satisfied rhythm. Charlie kept a peaceful vigil over the laughing children and the healed soldiers, his long mission of keeping his master anchored to this earth finally complete. Watching the beautiful valley rise triumphantly from the silent ashes of its tragic past, the mechanical song of the water wheel became the valley's heartbeat, a constant reminder that what was once broken could not only be mended, but could also sing again. In the months that followed, the old master woodshop evolved into a beacon of hope for the entire region. Veterans who had once hidden in the dark mountain crevices found purpose in the grain of the white oak, their scarred hands finding steady labor alongside local craftsmen, while the laughter of children brought color back to the Emerald Lake. David Rowan no longer carried the heavy weight of his armor. His military discipline had found its true purpose not in war, but in rebuilding a sanctuary of love. The tragic silence of the family history had been completely washed away, replaced by the profound truth that growth and healing are always possible when a community chooses to look beyond their own wounds to lift one another up. Surrounded by his grandfather Frank, his loyal neighbor Silas, and his resilient fellow soldiers, David finally found his anchor, standing proud under the golden sky as a living testament to redemption, unity, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Sometimes, the heaviest storms we face in life are not meant to destroy us, but to wash away the walls we built around our hearts. God works in mysterious ways, often sending his greatest miracles through the quiet, unyielding love of a grandfather, the open arms of a broken neighbor, or the faithful rhythmic thump of a loyal dog's tail. When you feel abandoned by the world, remember that your true worth is like a fine grain of timber, carefully watched over by a higher power, waiting for the right moment to be brought out into the warmth of the sun. In your daily lives, let us remember to extend a gentle hand to those who are silently fighting their own internal battles, for it is in lifting others that we find our own healing.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once feel forgotten.